welcome to Technically Speaking, where scientists and engineers come together to chat about a common interest, share knowledge, and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Ellie, and I'm joined by Laura and Antonia to talk about inventors, product developers, and what their work means for our daily lives. So, Laura, what do you know about this?
So I'm a scientist. I used to work at a university doing fundamental research into things to do with nuclear waste. So obviously my fundamental research had a very clear application. But it means I know a little bit about making discoveries in the laboratory and then what that means for the wider world. So I'm kind of interested in understanding more about the difference between inventors, product developers, and how does product development actually make a difference to our lives? There you go.
There we go. Antonia, you've got an engineering background, so I guess you've got a little bit more of a different take?
Yeah, so I love science, but I don't think I can ever get right into the detail of how the fundamentals of the universe work. I want to know what can we apply it to. Then there is also almost like a genre of YouTube where there are people with engineering or robotic skills and they make pretty useless inventions.
Is any invention useless? We'll get onto that, I'm sure.
We'll find out. But one of the YouTubers that I've watched before is Simone Giertz. She made loads of useless robots and then she became a product developer or an inventor, depends how you want to phrase it. One of the key things was she spent 3 years developing a coat hanger, which she called a coat hinger.
I have seen this. Yes.
And I thought, is this an invention or is this a new product? I want to see what other people think about this topic.
Yeah, very interesting. So I would say that Antonia probably cares more about the use of something, perhaps, and Laura cares more about discovering something brand new to the world.
Definitely. Don't really care what happens next, just as long as I've discovered it and I can pass it on to someone else to do something with.
You found it. So I think maybe we need some definitions to start with. So what would you say is the difference then between inventors and product developers?
I tried looking into this and I struggled with it. I ended up looking at like patent law essentially. How do you patent something?
I think that's a good start. You've got to think about the legalities of these things.
Oh yeah, it's part of if you've got a product that you think is unique and you want to make money off it. I think that's one of the key differences. A product is something you want to make money off. An invention or maybe a discovery, I think it's probably a difference there as well. It's just something you've found out, whether you want to make money off it or not in my case.
Antonia, what do you reckon?
Oh, that's an interesting distinction. Yeah, I suppose product is inherently something you try to sell. Invention you make. I think one of the defining things probably is if it improves quality of life, like it makes things better or easier. Or is that an altruistic view of what a invention is?
I feel like ultimately it should be. When I looked at the difference between the US Patent Office and the UK Intellectual Property Office, the US Patent Office says it definitely has to be useful. The UK Intellectual Property Office doesn't really care.
I suppose you could also discover something that doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on you. You know, if you discovered a new black hole or something like that, it's good to know about, but it doesn't really mean anything for your daily life particularly.
Yeah, but I feel like that's a discovery of something that's already in the natural world, so it's not necessarily an invention.
Ooh,
I wonder if an invention should be something that wouldn't already exist in nature or wouldn't have the potential to exist in nature.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, does it have to have some sort of human control or human ingenuity to bring it into life?
Perhaps then, if those are the differences, what are some examples in our lives that show these things that have developed?
Yeah, Antonia, don't you have experience of working for a company that was a spin out from, was it the University of Manchester, or am I misremembering that?
It was. I was thinking whether it was an invention or a discovery because the founder found a better way to produce quantum dots, so they filed a patent for that. So is that an enhancement of a process that already existed? And so it's not really discovery.
I would argue yes, because presumably there was a way of doing it before and they found a better way. So that to me says product development rather than invention of something brand new.
Maybe the process was so novel though, that is kind of an invention though.
Yeah, perhaps. I couldn't tell you enough about quantum dots to shed any more light on that, I'm afraid. What about something that we're all familiar with? What about something like music?
See, I was fascinated by this at one point because I grew up in the 90s and I used to record songs from the radio, on a cassette by pressing play and record at the same time.
Oh, yes.
And then everything went online because I remember being like a huge Napster user.
I was trying to think of the first one. I remember my brother downloading music for me as like the very first iterations of you can have an MP3 file on your phone. And you could have like 5, and we all thought that was incredible.
Yes. See, I remember a time when I said to my colleagues, I've got an MP3 player and I've got a mobile phone. Wouldn't it be great if I could just combine the two so I only had to carry one product around? They all looked at me like I was crazy.
And look where we are today.
Exactly.
And we had a separate camera as well.
That's so true. Like smartphones, I suppose, are one of the most combined technologies. Is that an invention then, to combine an MP3 player, a phone, a camera, or is it product development that's made the 3-in-1 that we all have in our pockets?
There probably was an invention that made things small enough that it could fit onto a phone.
Yeah.
But maybe the smartphone itself isn't an invention.
I don't know. I guess maybe the first time someone did it, it was quite revolutionary. There was a big fanfare made about it, wasn't there?
Yeah.
But like you say, there's an awful lot of fundamental science that went into making things small enough to fit them into something that actually worked, that didn't do things like get hideously hot and set your clothes on fire, maybe.
I mean, they still do that sometimes, don't they? You see those reports.
But yeah, I think it's a blurred line. I don't think there is a hard and fast definition between invention versus product development. Maybe it just depends on how you want to spin it, how exciting you want it to sound, because I think invention sounds more exciting than product development.
I do agree with that sentiment.
Yes.
I think invention sounds cooler, and like inventors, I feel perhaps are less of a thing now than they were back in the day.
Yeah, I agree.
People would say like the invention of the light bulb or the internet or something like that as like a big fundamental change in human history, whereas I don't think people would say the iterations of like an MP3 player to an iPod to Spotify potentially have the same effect. Do you guys agree?
I think if you worked in the music industry, you probably would disagree. Because it did quite fundamentally change how people knew how popular things were. So the top 40 in the UK used to be someone phoning up different record shops and saying, how much of this album have you sold?
Wow.
And then totaling that up and then announcing it on radio. And that was how everyone knew what the top songs were.
I never thought of that. I just always assumed they did it on, I guess, downloads or streams or whatever, but that was much later.
Oh, this was before streaming music was a thing. And back when we started streaming like MP3s, people downloaded them maybe not through the proper channel. And so how did you actually account for that? Because then you're kind of losing out on your popularity there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was say digital rights management is a big thing in itself, isn't it? If someone's downloaded things illegally, which is what Napster was kind of originally there for, versus the legal downloads you do via Spotify now, which are a lot easier, I think.
Wasn't that an innovation in the economy and how the product was sold? Was if we make streaming so easy, people wouldn't find another way to do it.
I think that has to be a big component of product development. Do people find it easy to get what you're selling? You could come up with like the most amazing invention ever, but if no one knows about it or it's really difficult to use for some reason, like it might be able to compose a symphony for you, say, but putting something into it to actually get a symphony out that people want to hear might be really difficult, then would you use it?
Well, I suppose that's all the new ones now, isn't it? With the AI generators and ChatGPT and all the rest of it, is you can put whatever you like and it will generate something. But is it any good? Does it make sense? Is it useful for you? And I suppose if you're a company, could you actually market it legally and have the patents and all the rest of it as well, which is a big grey area, as we're finding.
It's about the ease of things. So in my job as an energy manager, that actually plays quite a big part, because even though people might know fundamentally doing certain behaviors like turning off lights, turning off things you don't use when you don't need them will save energy and therefore reduce carbon emissions, trying to convince people to do that all the time is not easy. So I'm trying to find, what way can I make it easier? Do I automate things? Do I set timers? Do I put things on schedules? Do I lock them physically out of turning things on at certain times?
I like that as an idea.
Yeah, you want a product that kind of replaces people's behaviors in that case.
Yes. Also, debatable, like how good is AI at figuring out what people need and adapting to it? If it was like air conditioning and having the right temperature, people experience temperature quite differently. No one agrees on what temperature they want.
Yes, our old car had an automatic temperature setting. I used to fight with it constantly. What it said was 14 degrees or 18 degrees was not.
But that's interesting as well. Would you say that the invention of air conditioning, is that invention or is that product development?
Is the refrigeration cycle a discovery or is it an invention?
Ooh.
I guess if you go back to the fundamentals, it's all about compressing a gas or a fluid to take in or release energy, depending on if you're compressing or expanding it. I mean, that's a fundamental piece of science that can be used in different ways, and it has been obviously to make refrigerants, heat pumps, air conditioning.
What about some more common things? We mentioned before the internet. What about that? Is that an invention, or have we discovered the internet?
I think that has to have been invented. It didn't exist in nature, if you're sticking with my definition of discovery. But what was the need for it?
Why did someone invent the internet?
Yeah.
So the World Wide Web was invented at CERN because scientists wanted to transfer data between computers. So literally what we wanted the internet for was to transmit information from one place to another.
For science.
And for science. Now not so much. But I think the precursors to it were also very similar. So they had computers on a local network, but the difference was, I think, having hyperlinks that would take you to a place that you didn't know before.
A virtual place, you mean, where the files and the information were stored?
Yeah, instead of having like distinct, my computer is connected to your computer, Ellie.
Yeah.
Now you go on a web page and you click on a link and it takes you to where that file is, which was what they say was the start of the internet.
I would say that was probably then more of an invention, because nothing necessarily, maybe slightly similar earlier iterations existed, but nothing on that scale existed previously.
Some people might argue it was a product development of people having a local network system.
And then it was the next natural progression to make it worldwide, as they say. What about inventions that might lead to future tech? What could we be looking at in the next 10 years or 20 years or 100 years?
Well, I do a lot of reporting for the Materials Research Society as a freelancer. And I've come across lots of really cool discoveries that I think maybe could become products at some point in the future. They're currently sort of at research level at universities at the minute. But one really interesting one, I think, is really tiny robots on that sort of the microscope scale that can melt through bars. The video is just, you look at it and think, wow, that is futuristic.
This is very cool. I came across this because one of my colleagues reported on this at work. When Laura says it's robots that can melt through bars, she is not joking. It's like little tiny Lego-looking figures made of gallium, and they melt and then reform very neatly on the other side of the little jail that they're in, which is pretty cool.
The thing that impressed me was it didn't stay as a puddle.
Yes.
Melting is not that impressive. The fact that it became the same shape again on the other side was mind-blowing.
So they do it using magnetic field, and that creates an electric current which causes it to heat up. That's what causes it to melt, and they can control its movement using magnets as well. So it's all about electromagnetism essentially. So they can get it to walk around, which doesn't sound like it's got an application, right? It doesn't sound like it could be a product. It's just a novelty. But it does have applications. Otherwise, they wouldn't have got grant funding for it.
Well, what are the applications then? What do you think they're going to do with it in the future?
So the example they were talking about when I interviewed them was for medical applications. They could use the magnetic field to get this little robot to move around the body, and it could do things like deliver a packet of drugs to a very certain location, so you only need the drugs in that place, which is a little bit how some cancer therapies work.
Okay.
Or they could also use it to go in to an organ and extract a foreign body and pull it out, depending on what it is, and if they can get it to form around it, I guess.
Create its own little cage and then pull them out.
I think so, yeah. That's how I imagine it anyway. That might not be what the researchers are imagining.
Maybe something more sophisticated.
Yeah.
Would you say that this then is an invention, that they've invented this way of manipulating gallium to form and melt and reform? Or is it just something that they've discovered? Is it fundamental science that they've applied in this way?
It uses things that are found in nature, I guess, but it engineers them in a different way, doesn't it, to do something that I doubt would really happen in nature. I mean, in theory, it could, but the chances are so small, I don't think it would.
No.
I don't think it's an invention yet, because it's not doing something.
It's not a product.
I think it's a discovery.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think it's more like we found out that it could do this.
Yeah.
If we manipulate it in a certain way, rather than we've made something that you can all use. Though if anyone wants to gift me a tiny little melty Lego man, I will happily take that.
Does it get to be called an invention once they've got something that they know it can definitely get in and deliver drugs in a certain way or remove foreign bodies, and then they've got an invention?
I think so.
Yeah, when they get that patent, then I'll give it its invention title.
Because we have that power to grant.
I do. Within the realms of the podcast, I do.
The Technically Speaking Invention Award.
Oh, maybe we should start that. That sounds great.
These guys are based in the United States. I know US universities are really big on spin-out companies, so I assume it will be a product from a company at some point.
Yeah, that's true. What about any other current tech that we know of, or current discoveries that could have future applications?
I think you'll like this one, Antonia, because it's about the energy industry and sustainability.
Oh, yeah.
But something else I reported on was about creating semi-transparent photovoltaic cells, or solar cells essentially, that you can use to make glass panels of a greenhouse and also power the greenhouse as well. So if you want to control the temperature and the humidity and whatever else in there, you can use electricity from the photovoltaic cells to do that. So you have better food security, lower carbon footprint, and your greenhouse is your powerhouse.
That's pretty cool.
I like that a lot. So were they still clear? Or were they like, I'm imagining them green for no reason. I'm thinking leaves.
They transmit wavelengths that the plants can use, so they're not fully transparent to all wavelengths of visible light, but they do absorb at a particular wavelength that the solar cell can use. This is a big thing about solar panels. They're only, 20 or 30% efficient because they can't absorb all wavelengths of light. So it makes sense to have some that will pass through that would be useful in some way.
See, this to me sounds more like an invention, that they've invented this special type of photo glass or photomaterial.
Or is it still, because it's still a solar panel, they've just developed a new type of solar panel? But it sounds really good, because people are often talking about whether or not we should be using farmland for solar farms, where you put loads of solar panels in a field.
Yes.
We have to kind of balance food security with energy security, but in some ways the landowners are just selling it to the highest bidder.
Yeah, I think the innovation here, or the discovery, is that these are really, really thin solar cells, which is one of the reasons they can transmit the light. But when you get to that sort of scale of like nanometers, what you see is the different surfaces in your solar cell are actually really rough, which means that the electrons can't flow very well between one layer and another, so they can't get out into forming your electrical current and powering things. So they figured out a way to make those surfaces less rough, which is an evolution of the original technology, I guess. But they have to go all the way down to that tiny length scale to make something that is an engineering scale useful product.
I'd like to see that hit the commercial market and things be made out of that. Save a bit of energy, grow some more plant.
I feel like if it's transparent, that is way beyond what solar cells currently do. So I think that would be a new invention at that point, once they've got it all working and can sell it to you to use on your greenhouse.
Yeah, it's got to reach a commercial market first, maybe, to be considered a true profitable invention.
I have one more that definitely isn't an invention yet. This is very much fundamental stuff.
Okay.
I want to mention it because I got to go and meet them in Japan a few years ago to film them as they were working, produce a documentary for them. These guys were using a giant laser that uses X-rays to look at these tiny crystals that they'd grown in the lab. And what they want to know is what the structure of these crystals is, which will help them understand how they can transport electrons, which could have loads of different applications, not just for making solar cells and electronic components, but for making chemical reactions happen and various other things. So it could be useful for carbon capture.
X-ray crystallography is already an existing technology.
Yes.
So how is this different?
So that's limited to crystals that are sort of millimeter size, so you can really obviously see them by eye. These ones are much smaller than that, like micrometer scale. When they showed me this bottle of crystals in liquid that they had, you could just see little sparkles in it like glitter. So it was pretty tiny. And the idea is they can use these tiny crystals to do things once they figured out what their structure is and how they transport electrons, because the tiny difference in the composition of the crystals makes a big difference to how they function.
So say they figure it out, how long does they get from that stage to something that we can use to do something like carbon capture or something in tech or anything like that?
I would not be surprised if we're looking at sort of decades to develop an actual product. But if they put a lot of effort into it, they could get there a lot quicker. I guess it depends on how much more funding they can get.
It always comes back to the money, as we're discovering.
It does. Convincing people you've got a viable thing that is good for humanity is a lot of grant funding stuff in academia.
I feel like a lot of scientists and engineers, when they're in the research field, are looking at the cutting edge though, because they need those advanced technologies to progress the next thing. It's like the technology or our current understanding is the barrier to the next step. So maybe if it's well known enough, it could really push people's research. It's just whether or not they can make these laser X-rays happen in their own lab, or will it be too difficult to
do the analysis would be highly specialist because it's quite intense X-rays they're using. There are only 6 facilities in the world that can produce X-rays this intense. But they do want to make it more accessible to the wider research organisations. So they are developing a way of analysing their data that they will share freely to any scientist that wants to use it.
Oh, that's nice. We like that.
Yeah, so they're doing something for free and also, I guess, eventually looking to create a product they can sell.
Yeah, like if more people need it, then they get more money too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What would we like to see? Because I remember being a kid and being told, oh, in the future, we're going to have flying cars. Like, that was the big push for, like, the mid-2000s. Like, 2050, we'll have flying cars. But I don't see anyone developing that. I don't see that happening anytime soon. But what would you like to see happen?
Teleportation.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
That's a solid choice.
How would you do it?
Probably the energy required to make us into a dispersible format and then reconstitute us.
Would you disperse it like in Star Trek, or would you just make a copy and then destroy the original?
Oh. I could just see that going horribly wrong if you forget to destroy the original. And then there's 2 of everyone or 10 of everyone walking around. That's a sci-fi plot waiting to happen.
Yeah, so you'd have to have some sort of mechanism in there that would stop you just making multiple copies of a person. And you'd have to figure out the whole consciousness thing as well, which scientists are working on. I keep seeing news articles about quantum entanglement in people's brains as what helps lead to consciousness.
Oh, do you think we're going to all be uploaded into some great supercomputer in the future? We'll get rid of bodies and we'll just be internet consciousnesses floating around.
I think so, but I don't want that. I think we've discussed this in a previous episode about do you want to live forever? And
Yeah.
I said I'd like being out in the world and feeling things.
But what if you know, all the impulses in your brain was telling you you are experiencing this, you are outside. Was it Plato's cave, that thought experiment? If that's all you see, that is your lived experience, then how is that any different from you actually experiencing it?
But that's not my experience now, right? And I feel like on some fundamental level, I'd know whether I'm a biological entity.
You'd know what you were missing.
Yeah, because I've already experienced it.
Yeah, you've tried 3D glasses and you can't be convinced that that 3D movie was actually 3D.
Oh my god, no. They give you a headache, those things. No.
Oh, is that an invention? That's a good one. These are, the Oculus Quests and whatever else they're called, the virtual reality headsets. Or is that, again, just product development from, 4K, 8K TVs and IMAX cinemas and all the rest of it?
Combined other technologies, isn't it? With the Wii remote, when it could see where you're pointing on the TV, it kind of knows which way you're facing, so it has a kind of gyroscope. So it's better, it's different from a TV.
I'm guessing it's been patented or patented, depending on where you are in the world. So I guess it is classed as an invention.
I think probably it's an invention. We didn't have anything really like that before in the same way that we do now.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of sewing at the minute to change tack entirely. And I sometimes fight with my sewing machine, probably because I'm not a very good machinist. But I also don't think the sewing machine has changed a lot since it was come into widespread use in, I think it was like the 1840s or something. There were various patents taken out around that time. It was around the time of Industrial Revolution, so it's no surprise. They were looking at ways to make labour-saving devices for things people genuinely have a use for, like wearing clothes.
Yeah.
But it would be nice to see a machine that is easier to use and I don't have to get as annoyed with. But what that would look like, I don't know.
Do you think it would be fundamentally different?
I would like to think it could be fundamentally different because it is a little bit of a faff to load up all the threads and get everything lined up and then manage it. And ultimately you manage how fast it goes with just pressing your foot on a pedal.
Yeah.
Which is actually kind of difficult. I mean, it's like driving a car, so you'd think it wouldn't be difficult, but my machine seems to be worse than a car.
What would you rather have? Would you rather have some sort of touchscreen button that would control the speed, or would you rather have a dial or voice-activated sewing machine?
Ooh, that would be helpful. Because you'd end up using all 3 limbs at various points to control it in a certain way.
Or do you flip it on its head? There's 3D printed knitwear, so instead of having to control it all together, you put in your pattern, but it's in 3D, and off it goes, just like a 3D printer.
So we've taken Laura completely out of it. We've just made it...
I do nothing.
Yeah, you do nothing. You just press go and your garment is created for you.
When I tried to make clothes, sometimes cutting fabric was really difficult.
You wouldn't think it would be either, but yes, I have the same thing, and it ends up not being
Yeah.
exactly the way you wanted it to be.
Yeah, especially because depending on the texture of it, it would move.
Yeah, I feel like our entire audience is just saying, you just buy clothes, though. You don't need to make them.
Yeah, I think this has been invented out for you. We've got...
But someone's still making them.
Yes. Or even if it's largely, much more scaled up on a big production line.
Yeah, there's a lot of bits that a machine still cannot do.
Yeah, and if you've ever used a sewing machine, like mine is incredibly noisy when it's at full speed. Imagine an entire workshop floor of noisy sewing machines. I know older people that have hearing problems because they worked on a machine shop floor their entire life. So there's definitely a human quality of life improvement element to do there. Obviously, those people still need jobs, though. And that was a big thing about sewing machines in the Industrial Revolution. Some people didn't patent their idea because they thought people would lose their job.
It's like automated supermarkets now that don't necessarily need anyone to be on the checkout. They just need people to restock the products on the shelves. So you go in, immediately the cameras clock that you're in there. The cameras know what you're taking off the shelves. By the time you get to the till, there's no person. It automatically knows what you've picked. It fills your basket. You pay. You don't interact with another human. It's all entirely automated.
Which is nice in some ways, but also a little sad. That
Yeah.
you can get all the way through something like that without talking to a human being.
Yeah, it's very interesting how much the machine world will take over and how automation can become such a huge part of daily life.
Yeah, I think that means there would be a shift in how society fundamentally works, which could also be classed as a sort of invention if society's doing new things. Do we all shift from more just making things to a more of a service type industry where everyone's going on holidays all the time and experiencing new things, having guided tours of mountains and whatever else?
I mean, that doesn't sound terrible. I'd like to go on holiday all the time.
That sounds like a utopia.
Well, I think maybe we've wandered a bit too far away from what we were talking about before. So we've gone all the way from what is an inventor, what is a product developer, through the definitions. We've talked about spin-outs, we've talked about the evolutions of things like music, from cassette to MP3 players and streaming services. We've even talked about where the future might lead and the cutting edge of science and new materials. Thank you very much for listening.
The views expressed in this podcast belong entirely to the person that said them. They do not represent any industry or organisation. If you enjoyed listening to these views, it would really help us out if you could rate us, leave a review and tell a friend. This podcast was sponsored by no one, but if you're interested in funding us to continue to have frank discussions about science and engineering, please get in touch.